Hello, this is Taylor Ellwood with Magical Experiments, and I'm really excited because today I have Sara Mastros here on the podcast being interviewed. Sara, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and where we can find you on the web.
Oh gosh. My name's Sara Mastros. I am in Pittsburgh and I do a lot of like local in-person things that are just starting to start up again now that we've maybe made it out of quarantine times. Online, the easiest places to find me are at witchlessons.com, which will land you on the part of my website that has like courses and lessons, but then from there you can get to everything else. But that's just the easiest URL to remember. And then I'm quite active on Facebook. So if you just put my name into Facebook, and the truth of the matter is like, my last name is pretty unusual. So if you put Sara Mastros in quotes on Google, everything that comes up is going to be me.
Yeah,
So
you and I have the benefit of sharing an unusual name. Like I have an unusual name too. So it's really,
right?
there's not too many other Taylor Ellwoods out there. There is like one other person who ironically enough is a Christian rock musician. Poor guy.
Right? Yeah, no. I always think it's so weird. Like some of my friends, like Jason Miller, he like meets other people named Jason Miller. And I feel like if I met somebody else with my name, I'd have to have some kind of like Highlander battle to the death where we
Yeah.
decided which one of us got to be Sara Mastros.
I know. It would be kind of, I hope that doesn't happen with me and the Christian rock musician, but I could see
Right?
it.
No,
So,
because my family's last name got changed when they immigrated to this country, like relatively recently, I actually am confident that I am closely related to everyone with the last name Mastros.
oh, that's cool. So you've written a couple of books. You have
I have.
the big book of Incense, and you also have the Orphic hymns,
I do.
Grimoire.
I got them pulled out. Yeah.
Nice. Can you tell us a little bit about each book and where we can find them?
Sure. So Orphic Hymns Grimoire looks like this. It's in first edition. The first edition, I will let people know, is actually going to go out of print pretty soon because there is a new second edition coming out from Hadean, I believe, in September. So the Orphic hymns are a collection of sacred poetry from ancient Greece. They cover sort of like the regular gamut of like Greek gods, and then additionally some more obscure Greek gods are sort of thrown in the mix as well. So my book has, I use the word translation, but you could fairly call them like more like interpretations. They're relatively loose translations in the sense that like if you read Greek and you look at the original Greek, I think like my poems are identifiably line by line the same thing, but they're very much in a modern vernacular. Like my goal in writing them was to think like if Orpheus were writing these in English today, how would he say them, right?
Yeah.
And then in addition, there's like a lot of commentary. So there's commentary on a lot of like the epithets and sort of like more technical translation commentary, but there's also like spells and stories. And the book comes with, I should have pulled one, with icons, right? So this is the like special edition that comes with color ones, but most of the editions come with black and white line illustrations, which I actually think are better. So I really encourage people to color them in themselves, either color them in the book and then they have like a really custom like book that is just for them, or just to like photocopy out the icons. I really like coloring as a magical activity because truth be told, like I'm not the best drawer in the world. So like for me to like draw something complicated like a goddess while I'm in trance doing magic is just like beyond my artistic skill. But like these illustrations, which are by a good friend and co-magician of mine named Brian Charles, he did all the illustrations. Then I can color them in, right? And it's sort of like a slow and meditative process where I can sort of like, it gives me a mechanism for which to like bring the spirit through. And it's really easy to think of like each color as a kind of energy that I'm like layering into it. So I really like to use them as portals and icons, but I also really like to use them as talismans. So I sometimes will like make one specific to a specific endeavor and like put some sigils and things in the illustration itself. So I'm just a huge fan of his illustrations as magical tools, and there's a lot of like talking about how to do that in the book.
They look really beautiful. And I would say that, I mean, I think as someone who creates magical art myself, I mean, it is really important to kind of develop those correspondences. I like the fact that you encourage that with people because
Yeah.
it's really allowing them to form their own relationship with the spirit as a result, which is so important. There's really not a one size fits all approach to working with spirits. I know you know that, and I know that, but I think it's good for other people to hear that as well. And so like, that's a great example of how, you really can form your own relationship, like with a book where you're using that book as a way to connect, but then you're also coloring that art, but you're coloring it in the way that makes sense to you, because the color you might choose for Demeter could be a totally different one than I would choose, and that's perfectly okay.
Right, exactly. So I will say a lot of times when I color gods, like I think the one I showed had like a quite sort of human skin tone, but I also do a lot of like greens, and I really like personally metallic skin tones for gods. That's what I usually do. I really like that kind of magic. And like I said, that'll be out in a second edition from Hidean in September. And we'll come back and talk more about that later, I assume. And then this Incense book came out, I don't know, I think December 1st from Wiser. This one, the Orphic hymns is still sort of special edition, right? And then like the more mass market version will be out in September. So you can get that on my website or just by Googling Orphic hymns Grimoire. Like you can buy it on Amazon, although I'm just going to mention, I would never encourage anyone to buy anything from Amazon, as I do not really support Amazon and its mission of terribleness in the world.
Tentacular Cthulhuid.
Right, exactly. I'm now using Bezos as a generic name for like capitalism demons, because doesn't Bezos just kind of like sound like the name of a goetic demon?
Yeah, hey, yeah, there you
right.
go.
So I just now use that name as a demon. So Big Book of Magical Incense is a slightly more like mass market book in the sense that like Orphic hymns, I understand, is kind of a niche thing. Like if you're not into Greek mythology, you're maybe not going to be that into that book. But Big Book of Magical Incense, I think, is really like appeals to a lot of different people because it does a lot of things. So it's basically in two sections. In the first section, I kind of walk people through individual ingredients, right? And so even though I am technically discussing them in the context of incense, it's really the same kind of information you would use for any kind of like magical like potion, basically, like any way that you're using sort of plant materials in magic. Like obviously if you're going to eat them, there's some like special considerations, but truthfully, there are very few. I have eaten basically every incense mixture I make, and they're not always delicious. Some of them are delicious. Aphrodite's Kiss, for example, ground on top of vanilla ice cream, excellent.
Magically delicious. I'm thinking like Lucky Charms at this point.
Exactly. So I go through individual ingredients, and my goal there is really to teach people about ingredients, but like if what people want is like a big catalog to look herbs up in, I think the internet is better for that than any physical book would be. So in the book, more so than like having an exhaustive catalog, what I'm trying to do is really like use the plants I'm talking about as examples to try and teach people the skill of like, well, here's a plant that I like found in my backyard and I want to know about its magical virtues. It sort of talks you through how to like start with like the physical virtues of the plant, right? Like what color its flowers, or like what kind of chemical constituents are in its leaves, and like what niche does it fill in its ecosystem, and extrapolate from there into magical uses, because the magical uses of a plant are like just part of the like personality of that plant, right? So that's really the goal of that section, is to sort of build that skill. And then the second half of the book is recipes, and it's kind of the same goal, right? So more so than like I understand, I'm not saying people shouldn't follow the recipes, but my goal is again to use those recipes as sort of examples to just like teach how to build a recipe for any particular specific thing, right? So it's split into sort of categories, right? So first there's incense to like set a vibe, which I think is actually normally what we're doing with incense, right? So I give the example of like, this is the kind of incense I burn when I'm having a party. Like, this is the kind of incense I burn when I'm sick, right? And this is what I burn when I'm sad and lonely because it's quarantine and it's cold and I want to imagine that I am on a tropical island filled with wonderful people, right? And I use those examples as a way to like teach how to start with like kind of the vibe you're trying to have and turn that into a recipe. And then we move into like offering incenses for spirits, which I actually think is the easiest kind of recipe to make, truthfully, because it's like quite targeted usually. And usually you have some starting information about like some plants that spirit might like. So
Right.
again, there's, I don't know how many examples, 30 or 40 maybe, examples of different spirits, like specific spirits for whom there's a recipe. And again, in each recipe, I try and explain like why each thing is in that recipe. Because I found, when I was learning, I would find these recipes and I'd read them and I'd be like, wait, why is there cinnamon in this? And, usually after a while, you would start to get an intuition. Like, I understand why cinnamon is in, like, when cinnamon is in a love spell, it's there to like spice things up, make things a little warmer, right? And like, you get a feel for it, but sometimes you would read this recipe and you're like, what the fuck? Like, why? Sorry for my language. Like,
That's
why
okay.
did this person choose to put this plant in this recipe? And there was never any explanation, and I found that infuriating. So that's really like my goal in this book, is to explain like, here's why I chose to put this in here, because I feel like once you know why, then it's really easy to make substitutions, right? Which I feel like is a thing I always want to do, because I do. I make incense for a living. So I have like a vast pantry of incense supplies, but I feel like normal people do not, and there's no reason they should. Like, you know what I mean? Like a handful of plants, most of which hopefully you can like just find in a ditch near your house. Like, once you really get to know those plants and understand them, it's really easy to look at a recipe and be like, well, here's why this is here probably, so I can use this thing instead. And that's really the goal of the book, is to sort of like build those skills. But it also provides, I'm sure my publisher is embarrassed that I don't know how many recipes. I'm going to say around 100 recipes and maybe 60 plants. I feel bad. I'm supposed to know those numbers, but I don't.
Well, that's okay. No one's judging you here. And if the publisher is, I'm just gonna say, like, really chill out. Like, the important thing is you're talking knowledgeably about what you're talking knowledgeably about what you do. And I think it's fascinating. I mean, you made a really good point about like, wanting to know, like, if you want to make substitutions, like, why is something there? Why,
Right.
And I think that's really important, like in magic in general, whether you're doing some type of alchemical work, making an incense, doing some kind of just any magical ritual or whatever, understanding why something is there is really important. And I don't always see that. So I think it's really good when somebody does make the effort to do that, because that takes that work a lot further than, oh, now I understand why this is this way, what the thought process was, and how this informs what it is that I could do with this, as opposed to, well, I don't quite know what I'm doing and why, but I'm just going to do this anyway and see what happens.
And I mean, that's how I learned. I'm like, I definitely am a big believer in the like fuck around and find out school of learning, but I do feel like that goes faster with some guidance. But I thought when I was planning out this book, like the initial stages of thinking about like what a book on incense looked like, I started talking to people who really liked cookbooks, because after like relatively shortly, it became clear to me that what I was writing was a cookbook. And I cook, like I put dinner on the table every night, but I don't read cookbooks. Like, I'm not that kind of cook. You know what I mean? So right. I started talking to people who did, about like what they liked about cookbooks, like what their favorites were and what they liked about it. And that's kind of what it came down to, right? Is that like what people who liked cookbooks liked about a particular cookbook was the way it like explained how the recipe came to be, and in a way that like provided them like the encouragement and also the like inspiration and also like the permission to make up their own stuff. I don't know about you. I really find that like 80% of what I do as a teacher of magic is just give people permission to do magic.
No, that's very true. I mean, I think that a lot that in a lot of my books and also in my classes and stuff, that's very much the case, because it's kind of like, well, okay, here's what I've done and here's exercises and stuff. But at the end, I'm always like, but now it's time to take it further and make it your own work. And the only way you're going to do that is by leaping off the cliff. I've shown you where to go. Now it's time for you to take a leap of faith and see where you go and discover. And I think that's true. I mean, that's the best kind of teaching, is knowing when to step away and let the person teach themselves. Like, you can be a guide, but at the end of the day, you shouldn't really be their teacher. You should be a guide that helps them along the way.
When I taught high school, we had a little saying that went, guide on the side, not sage on the stage.
Yeah. And I like that. That's a good one.
I think about that a lot when I'm teaching, especially because, being a sage on a stage is really fun. So like, I kind of want to do it because it's fun. Like it's like a performance that is enjoyable as a performer. But I have to remind myself, like, oh no, that's not how humans learn, Sarah. Like, sit down and be quiet. But I am by nature perhaps a clown who just enjoys being on stage.
Hey, I get it. I like being on stage too sometimes. I can
Especially
be,
now I know I'm not supposed to admit this, but the thing I miss most from quarantine is an audience, like a room full of people who are actually there. I can hear them breathing. They clap and say my name. And I am not supposed to enjoy that. I know maybe that's an ego-y thing to enjoy, but I do miss it.
Well, I mean, I think as long as we can recognize that in moderation and find a way to ground ourselves into it. Like, I mean, I always enjoyed going and giving talks and having people there and being able to answer their questions and stuff. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing that always came away to me was when those people would be going out afterwards and be like, oh, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that.
Exactly.
That's what I was really there for, was to guide them.
That's what I want. And those are my favorite magic books, or books in particular, are the ones where like I can only read 10 pages before I have to put it down because I'm so excited. I now want to like do all kinds of things, right? That's my favorite. And so I try hard. Like that's always what I'm trying to be in a book, right? Is that like you read 3 pages and then do something. Like it inspires you to make magic.
So speaking of magic, tell us a little bit about your magical background. When did you start practicing magic? What's your history of magic? Because I think that's always kind of fascinating to explore too.
So I think that's a complicated question for me, because I sort of secretly believe that all humans start off as magicians, and then many humans maybe have it like beat out of them as kids. And my parents didn't really do that. Like I grew up, my mother certainly did not, my late mother did not appreciate the word witch being applied to her, but she didn't exactly deny it. You know what I mean? That is just not a word. She thought of herself as like an effective wisher, I think is how she would have described it, right?
Oh, so that's interesting.
Something she told me when I was young is that the way she said it was like, God is talking to everyone, not everyone is paying attention. Right. And so like that was just sort of like an undercurrent in my life. And also I think like many people, I think we're about the same age, like many people who grew up in like the, late 70s and 80s, like I just had a lot of unstructured, unsupervised free time in nature.
Oh yeah.
And I feel like that sort of played into it, right? And as I got older, I definitely understood that I was too old to still be talking to trees. But I did not stop engaging in that activity. I just maybe was not as public about it, right? So I feel like for me, there was this really smooth transition. But there is a moment when I found out that like the thing I was doing was called witchcraft. So when I think people have maybe heard me tell this story, and I want to apologize. I realize that my age in this story varies depending when I'm telling it. I don't really know how old I am in this story. Let's say 9. My largely estranged grandfather gave me what was intended to be a birthday present, but it was not my birthday. But he tried, whatever. Right. And he gave me like a gift certificate for young people listening, books didn't used to be that easy to get, especially like when you were 9 and lived in Amish country. Like my accessibility to texts was not that high. Right. But so I got this catalog to a mail order book company and a gift certificate, and I was looking through the catalog, and in the nonfiction section there was a category called witchcraft, and I knew what nonfiction meant. That meant it was real, and I knew all along. I was like, I knew witches were real the whole time, but everybody's been telling me they were fake, like they're only in stories. So I was like, mom, are witches real? And she very politically was like, well, there are definitely people who think they're witches, right? Which seems like a pretty solid, seems like a better answer than almost anybody else was getting in the 80s, right? Good job, mom.
Certainly a political answer in a way, but yeah, I like it. That's a pretty good answer.
To be fair, I am sometimes tempted to answer that way, like, well, that person definitely thinks they're a witch. I know those people too, right? So I asked, like, can I get a book on witchcraft? She's like, yeah, but it's going to be disappointing. Like, it's not, like, I regret to inform you, Sarah, this is not going to be cool. It's just religion stuff. Right. And I was like, oh, well, okay. But I got some anyway. I got 2 books. I got a book that I'm embarrassed I don't know the name of, but I always call it Buckland's Big Blue Book of Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. I think it's maybe called just like Introduction to Witchcraft or something. And at least
It
you
is
know
his
what I'm
big
talking
blue
about.
book. I know
Yeah,
what you're talking about.
everybody our age knows what I'm talking about because it's big. It's like 8.5 by 11, and it's just a blue book with a white pentagram on the cover. And it's like, I mean, I think almost everybody, there were just not that many options when we were young. That was the most popular. I think many people read that. And like, you know, it's not necessarily a book that I would recommend today when there are a lot more options, but like, whatever, I could have done worse. I feel like what I got out of that book is magic is real. Like you can learn it, but it's hard. Like witchcraft is a craft that like you have to study and like develop skill in, and that like real magic is sort of hidden between the lines in like myth and history and some religion like topics. And I was like, well, okay, I can read between the lines. So that's what I got out of that book, really. Like magic. I mean, I got a lot of other things that I have since abandoned. Like you have to have one he god and one she god, for example, which like as a kid, like even as a like, I don't know, 11-year-old, that struck me as like, you know, I did not know the word heteronormative then, but it seemed weird. Partly like I was fully prepubescent when I learned that. So like the sort of like sexual context of there being a lord and a lady was fully lost to me. I was just like, okay, there's a sky mommy and a sky daddy. That's the way I have to do it. But the ones I picked were Hermes and Hecate, which are like the least gender norm. You know what I mean? Like
right.
I did no, that's not what I was supposed to pick. Like
but you did anyway.
Not, but I did, and I'm not gonna lie, like having dedicated myself to Hermes and Hecate at the age of like whatever, 12 maybe. Again, I don't know how old I am in the story, so I'm moving it around. That has never done wrong by me. Like that's been great. I would re-up that. That was an excellent decision on my part. Good job, little kid Sarah. And but though I will say that book, it didn't feel as like it was missing a sort of like romantic, like it didn't feel magical. Like when I imagined what reading a book of magic would be like as a 12-year-old, Buckland's book did not scratch that itch. But conveniently, the other book I got, which was called The Encyclopedia of White Witchcraft by Patty Slade, which I guess is what we would now call like British traditional witchcraft, maybe. It like when I try and talk about what I learned from that book, I'm hard pressed to say. Like Buckland, I did learn like some specific techniques. Like I learned how to make a candle spell. I learned how to cast a circle, sort of. Like, well, I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying the book didn't teach it, but like I only sort of learned it.
I just think it's a good way to put it. Like, you know, you kind of sort of learn it, and you figure it out more.
And then I just did it. But I mean, I don't know. I'd seen wizards cast circles in movies. I had to God, I feel like a lot, even still, like, so, you know, I've been practicing at this point for more than 30 years. And I still sometimes think like, I don't know, what would a wizard in a movie do right now? And then I just kind of do that. You know what I mean? Like, I think we all have this understanding of like sort of a narrative mythological understanding of how magic works. Like, and then you just kind of like make up some stuff to do that. Right. And not just that. I mean, I do a lot of really technical, like, oh, well, in this Solomonic pentacle, this letter means this, and this is why it's a hexagram and not a pentagram. Like, I love that kind of stuff too. But I also just like make up magic and have it work. Right. And I feel like that's a thing you develop over time.
Yeah, you get more experience with it. I mean, I definitely get that because I've certainly done enough of that myself. And I mean, that's
right, exactly, right.
Magical experiments,
right? Exactly, right. I agree. Like, it's all about magical experiments, and all the like technical learning I do is always, to me, just about like when we were little. My dad ran a garbage hauling business. That makes him sound like fancy. My dad drove a garbage truck when I was a kid, and like, which meant we had a lot of garbage electronics. Like, he would fish good things out of rich people's trash and bring them home. But the rule was we were only allowed to keep them if we could take them apart and put them together again. Oh, and that's how I think about, like, when I'm reading something like, say, an Orphic hymn in Greek, I understand what I am doing to effectively be reverse engineering that. Like, I know, like, this piece of magic has withstood the test of time. Like, generations and generations, the kinds of magic I'm looking at, thousands of years of magicians right? Especially things like Orphic hymns, which were not like lost and rediscovered. They were in continuous use, right, for thousands of years, and like they retained their value. So I want to like kind of take them apart to try and like figure out how they did that so that I can put them together to build new things that will have that same kind of power. Right. And so I guess that's my history in magic, because I just kept doing that. But that Patty Slade book I was talking about, it did have the like sort of romantic quality. Like that person felt like the kind of witch I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So even though Buckland's book was like maybe more instructive, the kind of magician that Ray Buckland was describing was maybe not the exact kind I wanted to be.
Right.
Right. It didn't feel like it didn't have the like romance, like for all his talk about how it was like hidden in mythology and folk tales, there was less like romantic fairy tale whatnot that I wanted in my magic. And Patty Slade had that. And Patty Slade also had like that book. I feel like the biggest thing I got out of that book is that like the invisible world is part of the world. And so like the more that you root your practice in just like the fundamental ways that nature works, like invisible nature also works in those ways. And I grew up in a, like, I give thanks, I grew up in a natural wonderland. Like I genuinely did grow up in one of the most beautiful places in the world. Sometimes people try and convince me to go to like scenic places, and I'm like, oh, this is definitely less pretty than the drive from my house to the grocery store when I was a kid, but cool. Right. Like I just grew up in a wonderful place with like a very sort of like active and lush nature. At least when I was growing up, the most fertile, like non-industrially irrigated land in the world is where I grew up, right? So I had that immediate connection to nature, right? And I feel like those two things together, this sense that like you can read between the lines in myth and history, that magic is real, but you have to like work for it. Like you have to learn how to do it. There is an expertise to it, in addition to just like a natural skill. Like there's a learned expertise. And then the second big piece was like you pull it out of myth and folklore, and then you also pull it out of nature. And then I just did that, and I kept doing that. But something I heard very early in my magical career is that you should like look to the paganisms. When I was coming up, at least the kinds of like the places I was learning, there was not really a clear distinction at that point between like magic and paganism. Like it was all,
yeah, it was all kind of melded
it was all
together.
one thing,
right.
And it took a while to like understand how those were different. But one of the things I was told was to like look to your ancestral paganisms. But like my mom's family is Jewish and my dad's family is Greek. So that just landed me very solidly in like the core of what we, I guess, now call like the Western mystery tradition, which I cannot tell you how much I hate that word, which maybe we should call it like imperialized colonizer magic. You know what I mean? Like it's a weird way to construct it, but that landed me very firmly in that. And full disclosure, a lot of internalized misogyny turned me away from like the more Wiccan-y end of that into like boy magic, like the really sort of hard, crunchy, like Kabbalistic lodge magic type stuff, which, I mean, I was also by this point, like, you know, a university student in mathematics, and then a graduate student in mathematics, and then a theoretical mathematician. Like I do have a facility for that kind of like crunchy magic, but the underlying cosmology, like I just was always going back to like 8-year-old me in the woods learning magic from like rocks and trees and dead people. And so I will say, like, the further I come in my magical career now, I feel like I've sort of come full circle, where now I'm back to doing magic like an 8-year-old, but just like a really sophisticated 8-year-old who also happens to read Hebrew and Greek and know a lot of like technical crunchy stuff. But in terms of like my understanding of how the world works, I am now fully back to like 8-year-old animist me. Like I'm just friends with the tree, and that's why the tree will help me.
Well, and yeah, I think that's really important, you know, that sometimes we come back full circle, but we come back full circle with all those experiences and understandings that brought us to that, you know, like, and,
Right.
you know, like how you approach the world when you were 8 years old, you wouldn't necessarily have approached that when you were 15 or 22 or 30
Right.
years old. But that the further you get away from it, the more that you're able to look back on it and then say, well, but how do could these experiences be applied to that worldview? And then you come back to it. So it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't think that there's really, I don't think there's really any right or wrong way when it comes to these kinds of things, but I like that because
I agree.
I found that in my own magical career that I have come back multiple times to where I started at, and that,
Right.
it's like what the work that I've done over the years, it's helped me to come back to that, but come at it with a different layer of understanding and realization
Exactly.
that makes it more
Yeah.
profound.
And I say I've come full circle, but like, I hope this is not the end of my circle, right? I hope that I'm
Right.
going to spiral out into some weird, new, exciting thing. And then for a while, right? And then I'll like bring that back and think about how to like cohere it into my system. So when people ask like what kind of magic I do, like, I don't know, like the Mastros method. Like I just like I feel like I did not grow up in a world like I didn't learn magic in a world like this where I had options. Like I learned from wherever I could learn from. So I'm like, well, this piece came directly from synagogue. Like I just learned how to do that piece in synagogue. And like this piece came, oh, this one tree taught me this. And this one is like, oh, it turns out that my BFF from Girl Scouts is now a professor of botanical medicine. So like I know a lot about herbs because she was super into herbs. And there's so many things in my magical career that like why do I have this, like, you know what is a magical tool that's really important in my magic is antique skeleton keys.
Mm-hmm.
And people think that's because Hecate, but it's actually because my late father collected antique padlocks. And so like when I was 9, I was not like I asked, like I was told I needed a dagger. And my parents were like, what do you need a dagger for? And I was like, witchcraft. And they were like, fine, witchcraft. But no, our 10-year-old cannot have a giant dagger. What do you do with it? And I was like, you point at stuff with it. I could not really explain why I needed a dagger, which I will say now, looking back, pro tip, if you can't explain why you need a tool, you definitely don't need that tool. But I understood it basically to be like tracing circles and opening things. And my dad was like, well, why don't you use a stick? And I was like, no, I have to have a wand and a knife. And he was like, well, how about a stick and a key? And I was like, yeah, okay. Right. So like for a long time, my first athame was actually a large, what is actually called a jailer's key, which is like a large cast iron key that is on my Hecate altar, but I can't show you because I'm too short to reach that shelf. Actually, that's what I was just looking at. Right. So like there's so much of that, just like weird, random. Like there's some OTO magic in my practice. That's because when I moved to Pittsburgh, I wanted to meet magicians. And the OTO was like the only people in the yellow pages to meet magicians. So I joined the OTO because I wanted to meet other magicians.
Well, and I think it's kind of funny because like you and I are basically the same age. So like I mean I remember too, like you kind of if you were learning, you learned, like a lot of people now have access to like resources that's unprecedented when it comes to accessing magic. It's like you can look stuff up on the internet, you can watch videos like this, you can you can take courses or other things, but like for me
I think
it was, oh, go on.
Oh no. Well, I was just saying, I think they have the opposite problem. I think for us, there was so little that you just like, you latched onto anything. But now I feel like there's so much, it's hard to like, I feel like I would be overwhelmed. Like, how do I choose?
Right. Well, that's just it. I mean, there is so much more now. Whereas
exactly.
like before it was kind of like, okay, like I remember my first book was Ted Andrews book, Andrews books, how to work with spirit guides, and then like working with fairy guides and elements.
I wish I'd hit that kind of thing early because I was way in before I knew any of that was an option.
Yeah, I kind of got lucky. I did not go down the Wicca route that so many other people did. Like when I was 16, I was.
Yeah, it did right by me, but.
And I'm not knocking it, but I didn't go down that particular route. Yeah. I ended up going down like this elemental hermeticism / neo-shamanism route. So I was kind of one of those, it was just like for the very beginning, I was going to go my own path that nobody else was really doing. And then kind of wind my way back.
I feel like the really like spirit alliance kind of magic, I was naturally doing that as a kid, but like none of the books I was reading talked about it. So I kind of like sidelined that practice. And then I just like, somebody was like, I saw a different friend of mine, like somebody else started, Allison Kachkowski, in fact, started taking shamanism classes, like basically Harner style, like core, whatever we call that thing.
Core shamanism.
I try to avoid that shaman word. I feel like there's a lot of drama.
Well, right. There is a lot of drama, but that's what it was known as.
So, yeah, right. And so she started hating, and she just explained it to me, and I was like, wait, what? And as soon as she explained it, I was like, I bet I can do that. And then I just started doing it. And then I took some classes from I consider my godmother, Caroline Kenner. Like I learned all that, but I was quite late in my magical practice before I learned those techniques. And like, I wish I'd had them earlier.
Yeah. Well,
there was a real, like I said, my internalized misogyny steered me away from some of those things and toward the more like high magic stuff, which, also good.
Right. Well,
I've never learned anything I regret learning. Never.
Yeah, well, that's just it. I mean, each person has their own path. I mean, at the end of the day, you talk to any magician or witch or whatever term we want to use, and they're going to tell you a different story about how they came to what they came to.
Exactly. And even now that there are like the appearance of these broad, like well-marked paths, like we all know that like if you're in fairyland, you stay on the path unless you want to have an adventure, but nobody ever becomes a magician by staying on the path. Like all the magic is out. You got to deviate from those paths into the weird at some point.
You do.
Yeah.
So one thing in your book of Incense, I looked through it a bit and I thought it was really cool. But one of the things that you touched on that I thought was really fascinating was the sense of smell and how under relied upon that is. So can you talk a little bit about that and why people might want to use incense and learn how to make incense of their own because of how smell can become an integral part of your magical work?
Yeah. So like scent is, I really do think that like of our senses, our modern world, like undervalues smell, right? And partly like we cover up a lot of natural smells, and we've become very accustomed to like environments that are very dense with quite artificial scent, right? Like your laundry, and then some people have like air fresheners, but plus there's still like what you as a person smell like and what the other people smell like and like what you had for dinner, and like all those smells are in a place. And when we smell things, what's really happening is, to grossly oversimplify the science, like little particles of stuff are going up your nose and directly touching your brain. And it's such an immediate kind of sensing, as opposed to like sight, where like the things you are seeing are very far from you. And scent also, I think, has scents are all drugs. Just like everything you eat is a drug. Like every chemical you put in your body is doing a thing. Scents in particular, like they produce noticeable and observable changes in the brain that make incense like particularly well suited to like getting you into different magical states of consciousness, because some of them there's like a chemical action in your brain that is facilitating that. And I also I never want to discount the like romantic fairy tale part of it. You know what I mean? Like when I imagine a wizard, there's definitely a big cloud of incense smoke in that imagination for me. And so I love incense, and I love how just like sensual it is. Do you know what I mean? There's such a drama to like dropping some plants on a coal and they sizzle, and there's like a cloud of smoke that like whirls and twirls in front of you, and maybe faces are in it. I just love everything about that. But also, like of all the kinds of magical potions, I think incense, which is basically like at its core, how you make incense is you like put some stuff in a bowl, mix it up, and then put it on something hot. Like that's all there is to it. It's like the simplest kind of potion to make. You're not really doing anything. You're just lighting shit on fire. So I think it's like a good, like that's why I wrote a book about incense as opposed to like a book about, say, oils, because I think incense making is sort of like the most primitive kind of doing that, of putting those things together. And then once you understand how to do that, you can branch out into like, oils just have a like more technical, I mean, I guess not if you start with essential oils, they don't. But what I like about incense is you can start with a living plant and get to a finished magical product. And no stage of that requires like a chemistry lab or like even really a kitchen or like any kind of sophisticated craft skill or like clever handedness. You just like know about plants or know plants as people.
No, that makes sense, and I think it's really important. I also think you made a good point earlier about how we try to sanitize our sense of smell. You know, a lot of people avoid smells and don't even realize that like some of the smells that we should be paying attention to are smells that could tell us a lot about our health. For example, like the smell of the human body is a great example, because you can tell if your body is sick or someone else's body is sick by the smell. And I mean, some people would find that disgusting, but personally, I think it's better to be
it's
really
entirely true. And absolutely. And, you know, during pandemic, I really like, while wearing a mask that kind of prevented me from smelling things, I really noticed how much I relied on like how people smell as part of my like just general knowing of their thoughts and feelings. Like part of, you know, I'm not going to say I'm not psychic, but like it turns out part of what I thought was psychic is actually I'm like maybe good at smelling people, which I did know. So for example, I can like smell when people are pregnant. And that's what you're saying about like those chemical changes in the body. I'm, for whatever reason, I think I'm maybe more attuned to smell than many people were, like, and I think that got me into incense rather than the other way around. But smell is also like anything else humans do, you can get better at it. Like you can practice and get better at it. So there's a little bit of an explanation in the book about like how to train your sense of smell, but like spoiler alert, it's by smelling a lot of things.
Yeah, well, hey, good
like
thing to do.
Yeah, like I'm not exactly encouraging you to just go around sniffing people, but if you could get away with it, you should definitely do that.
Like that. So let's talk a little bit about your Orphic's hymn book. You mentioned in the book that it's a grimoire. You know, I think a lot of times when people would think of like the Orphic hymns, you know, they might think of it as devotional poetry as opposed to a grimoire. So let's talk a little bit about the grimoire aspect of it and how it's a grimoire. And I mean, to some degree, you've already spoken to that when you were talking about the art and personalizing it. I mean, I think that was a great example of how that could be a grimoire because you're forming a relationship with the spirit.
So I sort of am using the word grimoire in two different contexts, right? But in two different ways that sort of arise from the same context. So like originally the word grimoire basically meant textbook, right? Like a grimoire was a book that was like intended to build skill in something, right? Like it's an instructional book, right? And the Orphic hymns are designed in that, like my version of the Orphic hymns is designed that way in the sense like that's why they're contextualized. Like there are specific like things I'm trying to teach over the course of the book, right? But we also, the way we use grimoire today, it also means like a spirit catalog, basically, right? With instructions for invoking them. And that's 100% what the Orphic hymns are. It is a catalog of, I'm going to say 88 spirits, but there's 88 hymns, but it's a little tricky because like there are multiple hymns to Zeus. Are they to the same Zeus or those like 5 different Zeuses? I feel like that's a complicated question that doesn't actually maybe have a full answer, right? And so they're also like grimoires in that context, right? It's a catalog of spirits and like an invocational ritual to summon each one. And not just summon them, like they make specific practical magic requests, which sometimes I find in some translations are not, it's not as clear that that's what's happening. Right. But like almost all of them, usually the last couplet, sometimes the last couple, the way I translate them, the last couple lines make like many times very clear, specific requests.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like, and some of those are what you would think of as devotional, like draw near to me and give me a happy life. But some of them are like really quite specific, right? Like heal me now. Right. Or like make my harvest good, like pretty specific practical magic requests. And like that's what they are, right? Like they are spells. And then there is this additional element that I think that until I started really deeply working with the hymns was not fully obvious to me. It is also one continuous ritual. Like they're in order and they go in that order for like a reason. And there's like a full takes about 10-hour ritual, like where you start at the beginning and go the whole way through, and then Orphic Bacchanal. Like the Orphic hymns are, in addition to being individual summoning rituals, are also one coherent liturgy for Orphic Bacchanal.
Oh, I think that's really interesting too. I mean, that you point that out, because I think a lot of times, people can read something and not necessarily fully grasp that aspect, like you said, if it's not very clear. And so making it clear, like, okay, here's a very specific request that's being made.
Right.
This isn't just a devotional activity. It's an actual working, and that you're connecting with and communicating with the Spirit in order to do a specific type of working.
Yeah.
It's again one of those things that I think a lot of times people can miss out on. So when you can make it more explicit like that, that's really helpful and very important. And that's one of the reasons why we need to continually look at these works and do the kind of research and work and experimentation that makes it more effective.
So one way that I really like to encourage people to experiment with the Orphic hymns, which I said in the first edition, but I will say now, if people having read it, I did not make clear enough. So I said more about it in the second edition. Like, you can drop the last couplet and replace it with a new one, right? So like, as long as you're in the, like, if you pray to Hygeia, whose name means health, for like help winning the lottery, that's maybe like it's not necessarily a good substitution, right? But I almost always, when I use them, I just get rid of the last couplet and I completely rewrite it for a new situation. And sometimes I just like make it specific. So for the healing ones, I usually, they're written in the like please intercede for us and our healing, but I will almost always take it out and put in the specific person's name, right? And just all of them, I just rewrite them. And how hard they are to rewrite is partly about like how many syllables. People with a lot of syllables in their name require more extensive rewriting to get it to fit in a couplet, right? But I almost always use them, like when I'm using them for spell work, I almost always drop the last couplet and replace it with like a more specific version of, like, the requests are pretty generic because these are intended to be sort of like off the rack spells, but like you can customize them to fit the exact situation you're in. And also you can write your own, like just from scratch.
Right. And I mean, and again, I think that's an important thing to recognize, that you can improvise, you can come up with stuff. I know, like, a lot of times when I'm doing magical work, I'll come up with chants off the cuff or improvise them. I might use the available chant, but then come up with something else as well. And I think that that's just as important as doing the, going with a strict interpretation of it. And sometimes people
I agree,
get very caught up in like, well, I got to do it exactly this way. And it's like, well, yes and no. I mean, maybe the first couple times you do it because it's a good way to feel into it and understand, like, here's the context. But at a certain point, you've also got to make it your own. So this is great advice, about how to make it your own, that, you're doing this hymn, but that you also have permission to make it your own.
Right. And so I come back to the cookbook analogy a lot, right? Like, the first time you bake a cake, you probably shouldn't improvise that much because there's actually like some complicated things going on in a cake, like some chemistry behind the scenes that you need to figure out. But like, once you've baked a bunch of cakes, especially if somebody has explained to you, like, here is what the baking soda does in recipes, right? Like, once you have that, then you like just develop this ability to like improvise around them. And then, so that's why my favorite magic books were always the ones that were just like spell books or recipe books. And it wasn't because necessarily, like, honestly almost never, I do sometimes do magic by the book, especially like when I got into like high ceremonial magic. I was instructed I had to do them by the book. Although I will say, like, sometimes I suspect that the people who are like, no, you have to do them exactly by the book, have not like maybe read that book, because you can't do them exactly by the book. The book is in conflict. Like, most of those Solomonic grimoires do not actually provide full instructions. And also sometimes they provide instructions that are at odds with themselves. You know what I mean? So like, there's a limit to how by the book it can be done. So you're always going to make those substitutions. But I did for a long time do things maybe more, but my impulse was always to like read 9 different ways to do a thing and then kind of like understand the structure from there. Right. And then once I had that understanding of a structure, I could like slot it in. So for example, Orphic hymns, there's kind of a template, right? So you start off with like the name of the diamond you're calling, right? The spirit you're calling, and just like a bunch of epithets, but not all available epithets for that spirit. You like kind of think about like what is the function of this call, and you're going to pick out ones like that. And then there's some things that are sometimes called historiola, which are basically like reminders to the spirit that they've done things like this in the past. So you're going to like not tell a whole myth, but like reference a myth that is relevant to what you want to do. And then you just kind of like butter them up for a while, right? And in much of like ancient Greek evocational poetry, here there would be a section that like explained why the spirit should listen to you, but in the Orphic hymns that reason is understood to be because you are an initiate of Orpheus, like you have the poet's gift, and that's why they should listen to you, because your words are pretty, right? And then you make a request, and then like, okay, thanks, bye at the end. So like, and then once you understand that template, you can like adapt it to situations.
That's
So
and yeah, it's interesting. I've been doing a bit of work lately with my magical partner with some gin magic, and so it's kind of similar with that. It's like, you know, you go,
yeah,
you
I
do
think
this thing, and then you make a request, and then you basically at the end you explain why you're doing it.
right. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, that very specific order is like definitely the way it is in Greece, and then but like broadly that's just how you do that, at least I will say 100% in like the greater Levant. So like North Africa and the Near East and like all of Eastern Europe are basically all doing it more or less. And that's right. That's the way the Psalms work too. Like that thing I just said, if you read any of the Psalms, they're exactly the same. The Orphic hymns and the Psalms are the same type of book and the same type of magic for the same purposes.
Yeah. So, you know, we're going to wrap up here. I mean, this has been a lot of fun, and we'll definitely have to have you back on again sometime. But what I'd like you to do is again, share where people can find you on the web, and
Sure.
then also leave a final word of wisdom for us, some final thoughts.
Okay. Well, the easiest place to find me, like I said, is witchlessons.com. We didn't really talk at all about like courses that I teach, but that'll land you on that particular page, and so you can see what's going on there, but that will also get you to everything else. Final words of wisdom. All right, here's what I will say. So here's like my biggest pieces of advice for other magicians, right? And the first one is just like get co-magicians. And like they don't have to be perfect. And honestly, like I sometimes think it's better if they do a pretty like far like a different kind of magic than you do. Partly because then you have like different techniques that you can bring to bear on similar situations, but also because you just learn things that you wouldn't have learned otherwise. But most importantly, like a real co-magician, I feel like their most important asset is that they will just call you on your bullshit. Like it's really easy to get all in your head and have the magic like never get like just have it be all in your mind and never actually get into the world and like make magic with it. And having a co-magician does force you to get it out of your head minimally into their head. You know what I mean? And so, and I feel like it's really easy, I think, as a magician to get in this place where you're like, I'm just delusional and I'm crazy and magic isn't real. Or I'm the most powerful wizard in the world. And I feel like a co-magician will be like, yo, Sarah, what the fuck? Like, you're being crazy right now. And I just think there is no substitute for that. Like actual people with whom you have an actual relationship in real life, like enough of a relationship that they will call you on your shit. Other advice, just like play and experiment. Like it should be fun, but that like I personally think the most productive kind of magical play is taking things apart and putting them back together again in different ways, like taking things apart to see how they work. That I think is just like the best way to learn magic is find good magic, right? And take it apart like piece by piece to figure out how it works.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I'm the same kind of way. I like to take things apart and put them back together again. I like to customize them. And I think that other piece of advice is also important. You know, when you get a chance to work with other people, like really work with them, not just talk magic, but actually work with them.
Yeah.
You know, everyone grows as a result of that. I mean, that's you know, you can only grow so much on your own and only grow so much from reading books. And even if you're doing stuff out of the books, at a certain point, you've got to work with other people.
It's super fun. Like I feel like we're like trying to tell people to eat their vegetables, but also there is no rush in my life as great as like working magic with other people hand in hand, sharing breath, speaking the universe into being collectively. Like it's it's amazing. Like, it's not just good for you, it's also super fun. Sexy, fun, adventure, awesome play. Love it.
So eat your vegetables and have fun while doing it.
Exactly. Like, vegetables are actually delicious, it turns out.
Who would have thought, right?
My late mother had many skills, but cooking was perhaps not among them. So,
well, I want to thank you for coming on the show. We'll definitely have to have you back again sometime.
I had fun.
I did too. And
awesome.
This was great. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.